じゃあよろしいですか。それでは予定の時間になりましたので、黒川委員。
Yes, we'd like to have Chairman Kurokawa begin the meeting. We would like to begin the National Diet of Japan Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Committee meeting, the 18th meeting of our commission today. First, we're going to have some questions asked of the witness, and we have the former president and representative director, Mr. Masataka Shimizu, who is here from the Tokyo Electric Power Company Incorporated formerly. He was working at TEPCO as the president from 2008 June to 2011 June. During the time of the accident, he was the president and the representative director at that time dealing with the accident. And this time, we would like to ask some questions of him that have to do with the time of the accident. Before we begin our questions, if Mr. Shimizu would like to speak, please feel free to do so. Hello, my name is Shimizu. Nice to meet you all. First, I would like to apologize from the bottom of my heart. Last year, in March, at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, there was the release of radioactive substances, and there was a very serious accident that had taken place. And of course, the people of Fukushima and so many people of our society went through a lot of pain and suffering and were troubled and were very worried over the many months since. I would like to take this opportunity once again to apologize from the bottom of my heart. I am very sorry. And today, I have this opportunity to speak before you at this commission meeting. And as far as the accident and what had happened before, during, and after it, I would like to cooperate fully in order that the Commission may be able to elucidate the causes for the accident. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Shimizu. Well then, today, mainly, we would like to have Mr. Nomura ask his questions, if we could ask for your cooperation. Thank you. My name is Nomura. Thank you very much. Look forward to asking you these questions. First, as far as Tokyo Electric Power Company Inc. is concerned, there is the president and the chairman. What is the relationship between the two positions, and what sort of authorities does the president and the chairman have? As far as the duties of the chairman and the president are concerned, of course we are both members of the board of directors, and we do, of course, have our responsibilities with regard to our operations. As far as the chairman is concerned, his responsibility mainly is to deal with other companies and organizations. And as far as the president is concerned, the president is most responsible for the administrative matters pertaining to the company. As far as this accident is concerned, after it happened, there was a situation that had arisen that was different from your usual administrative activities. As far as the responsibilities and authorities of the president and the chairperson regarding how to deal with the accident, how was that divided up? The accident, this emergency situation, had arisen, and this time it's the nuclear power plant, and we had the emergency countermeasures headquarters that was set up. And it wasn't just the nuclear power plant reactor, but there was also the disaster countermeasures headquarters, which was set up. And the president is the head of both of those headquarters. So therefore, the person responsible for the emergency situation would be the president, if he would kindly understand that that was the case. Well then, as far as this accident, and responding to that was concerned, then the president was most responsible in responding to that accident you have just stated. And as you are all well aware, on the day of the accident, the chairman and the president both were not at the Tokyo Electric Power Company headquarters. Is that correct? Yes, that is indeed correct. And as far as the president was concerned, why was it that you were not there at headquarters? If I could speak about what had transpired around that time. Before the 11th of March, I do believe it was the 9th of March and the 10th of March, the Keidanren had a meeting that was held at a local area that I was attending, and it was the executive committee meeting. And on the 11th, I was in Nara Prefecture. There was a commemorative event being held to commemorate 1,300 years of that temple, and the Federation of Electric Power Companies was also supporting them. And there was a restoration activity that was going on regarding the temple there in Nara. And at that time, I would be returning from Shikoku to Tokyo, but I needed to stop by. And I decided to participate in the temple commemorative event. And I went to the temple with the director who was in charge of Nara Prefecture. And there was also a research institute there. And a representative of that research institute was someone with whom I had met, and I was able to go and see the restoration work that was being done at the temple. Then at that time, the chairman was in China. And as far as the nuclear power plant is concerned, it's a very important facility, and the company, the two top people of that company that operates these important nuclear power plants, to not be there at the headquarters, from the point of view of the people, there must have been some very good reason as to why both of you were not there at headquarters. However, you said, as former president, you were there as a member of the Keidanren, visiting Nara and visiting the temple. And were you aware that the chairman was in China visiting for a good number of days? As far as this is concerned, the chairman's visit to China, that was something that I was aware of. As you had mentioned, Mr. Nomura, for the chairman and the president at the same time not to be there at company headquarters is not something that is ideal. And looking back, I do reflect upon this and feel this ought not have been the case. And am filled with regret. As far as that schedule is concerned, up until now, we tried to make most certain that we would both be there. There was an unwritten rule. As far as your plans at that time as president, you really needed to leave the company headquarters. It was that important for you not to be there. At the same time as the chairman wasn't there, there was a lot of schedule adjustment that took place beforehand, and it was very difficult to change the schedule due to the people that we were visiting. And as the Federation of Electric Power Companies and the chairman of that, your work there is separate from your work as president of the company. Yes, rather than saying separate, the Federation of Electric Power Companies, our company is a member of that. But as far as the support was concerned, that is the support work that was done at the Federation of Electric Power Companies. And at that time, you were the chairman of this Federation of Electric Power Companies as president at that time. As far as Tokyo Electric Power Company is concerned, what is the relationship between your company and this Federation of Electric Power Companies? As you are well aware, as far as this federation is concerned, there are 9, including Okinawa, 10 electric power companies, and it's an organization that has those companies as members. And there are common agenda items that are being discussed and policy that is being developed within that organization through our discussions with one another. Well, President, when you were chairman of the Federation of Electric Power Companies, as far as the severe accident response was concerned, there was legislation that was being put together to deal with that. Yes, I do recall that. As far as the putting together of that legislation is concerned, I don't have the confidence that I fully understand this as yet. But from the point of view of regulations, I do understand there was movement taking place in that regard. So it was 2010, the year before this accident took place. The Federation was very strongly against this legislation being put together, I do understand. Why is it that this Federation was resisting the actions that were being taken by the regulatory bodies? As far as the Federation is concerned, it's not just severe accidents, but as far as regulations, various regulations are concerned, as electric power companies, the current situation and the current challenges that we're grappling with, we give our opinions, and we also have our exchange of opinions with the regulatory bodies. And regarding these regulations and the pressure that we might exercise vis-a-vis the regulatory bodies or to soften their efforts, this isn't something that we do. That's my awareness.
For example, in regard to the possible enactment of measures against the severe accident, it needs to be met to fulfill what's stipulated in the regulations. Therefore, even before the disaster, countermeasures were in place for the severe accident before 3/11. But according to what we know, NISA, for example, has proposed a draft. And rather than stating some problems, it was that FEPC who has come up with its own proposal and said it is more desirable, and that's how you have negotiated. In that sense, as you have said, would you say that it's merely the response to the hearing that was conducted? Yes, that's my understanding. Now, let me ask you about the accident. We believe that if there were more countermeasures before the accidents, there could have been a possibility to prevent the accident. At least there were a number of opportunities to do so. For one, let me talk about the countermeasures against tsunami. At TEPCO, I'm sure various opinions were brought up to you as the president. Is that not true? In terms of a seismic level, that was revised in 2006, was it? The new seismic guidelines came into place, and the guidelines for the seismicity had been redrafted. And as the management, of course, without saying, we have been discussing these issues as part of the management. Having said that, basically, in regard to the seismic-related activities, which are relatively technical in considerations, it was carried out by the headquarters, who was in charge of nuclear power plants, as well as the respective divisions of TEPCO, where these were considered. And in it, if they are important issue for the management, then needless to say, it will be brought up to the management committee. You talked about the seismic countermeasures or the tsunami countermeasures, but were they discussed by the management? Do you have any recollection that discussions took place? When the seismic guidelines was drafted, yes, we did, but you are talking about time other than that? It could be now or at any time. What is the management policy that you have launched as the president? In regard to the revision of the new seismic guidelines, we have taken countermeasures to address the issue, but other than that, whether it's the earthquake and or should I say the tsunami, the discussions and considerations were not brought to me as of yet. All right. There is what's called the earthquake back check, and there was quite a bit of delay in the earthquake back check. Is that your understanding? Yes, rather than to say delay, we have lots of plants at TEPCO, and what we need to do is to analyze and evaluate each plant in terms of its seismicity. But in order to do so, it takes time to analyze. And at the same time, all the nuclear power plants are going to do the same. And depending upon the nuclear power plant, it will be quite voluminous in what needs to be done. Thus, for each and every plant, when we have come up with a schedule to reinforce the seismicity of each of the nuclear power plants. Of course, for each plant, what needs to be attained would differ from the next plant. But as you have pointed out, you said, quote, delay, unquote, but I would say that it does need time. That was our understanding. At Fukushima nuclear power plant, I take it that the seismic back check was not carried out much. Rather than to say delay, maybe I should say it was not even taken up. What was the reason for this? Well, in regard to the construction of the reinforcement, some of the plants were undergoing the reinforcement. As an example, at Fukushima number 2, the fourth unit, the reinforcement activity was underway. And if everything had gone as planned, it would have been completed by 2011. That was the schedule for the reinforcement. If so, in regard to the seismic reinforcement activities, so you knew how the budget was being spent. Is that true? Yes, as you say, that reinforcement construction is something that's going to cost a lot of money. A schedule is important, but in addition, you need to consider the expenses as well. And that's something that would be discussed at the management committee as well, so as to confirm how much cost it's going to incur. Of course, you would confirm, but it is up to the management decision whether to spend the budget or not. At TEPCO, be it the chairman and or the president, what's the decision on part of the management in regard to the execution of the budget? Is your question pertaining to execution? Yes. There is a schedule, or should I say there is a milestone being set forth, and basically the execution of the budget would be handled by each of the power plant that would be in charge of the reinforcement construction. However, there are numerous number of plants. And if you look at the execution of the overall budget for all the power plants, then it would be dealt with and was grasped by the division in charge of nuclear power plants at the head office. Did you have the understanding that there was a delay in their seismic back check? And did you instruct that it should be expedited? Well, in regard to the schedule, we did have much discussions, inclusive of myself. And as was said, it does need a lot of time, lots of analysis, and a lot of work, which is quite time-consuming. I had the understanding it should be done as soon as possible, and that was our shared understanding. What was the specific instruction you gave in order to expedite the process? What was it that the management gave as an instruction? As I have just said, I talked about the analysis, and I did say that to carry it out to the extent possible as stipulated in the law, to carry out the analysis in a speedy manner. So it was discussed, how can we expedite the analysis to be carried out? At present, as you look back, in regard to the seismic backcheck, it's not just for the earthquakes, but it could also address the natural disasters. And if you do all the check to the end, it would include measures against tsunami. And if you have the countermeasures in place, then it would mean that you would have the countermeasures against tsunami in place as well. Thus, as you look back at present, since a seismic backcheck was ordered, there was quite some time before it was launched. Don't you think that's one of the causes for this accident? I think it's very difficult, an issue to be evaluated, but there was associated phenomena to the earthquake in which, first of all, what we wanted to do is to improve the seismic nature, and having done so, we shall incorporate other measures, inclusive of measures against tsunami. In regard to the procedures, don't you think there were some mistakes or errors in the procedures themselves? Well, whether it's the countermeasures against earthquake and or tsunami at that time, I would say that I don't think there had been any. It's always the time. If there's an accident, then people come up with countermeasures against the accident. That seems to be the mentality of the people. But if you have tsunami, then you need to have countermeasures for the tsunami, and maybe the countermeasures against earthquake may be the second priority. Don't you think there's something wrong with it? Well, as I have just said, the understanding we had at that time is, of course, we need countermeasures against earthquakes as well as tsunami. They are equally important. But in terms of procedures or the priority, we didn't consider it to be too major a concern.
I'd just like to ask you some questions. After the accident had taken place, the chairman and the president were not there at headquarters. Who was it that had the ultimate responsibility regarding that? It would be the two headquarters that I had mentioned earlier. And there is a person who is substituting for the head of the headquarters in both cases. For the nuclear countermeasures headquarters, it would be Mr. Muto, who was the substitute. And as far as the emergency countermeasures headquarters was concerned, Mr. Fujimoto, who is vice president, was the person who was acting head. And so Mr. Muto was not there, and it seems as if Mr. Komori was the person who was acting in Mr. Muto's stead. And so it was Mr. Komori who was working on making certain that power could be accessed and venting activities could be done. And from Mr. Komori to the president, there has been contact made constantly, is that correct? Yes, from the point of view of receiving contact on the 11th, I think it was after the earthquake had taken place, about 1,500 hours. I don't recall clearly, but Mr. Fujimoto contacted me. He was in charge of the emergency countermeasures headquarters. And he said that such a headquarters was set up, and that was the report that I had received. And I don't recall the exact time. From Komori as well, from the nuclear countermeasures headquarters, I also heard from him that such a headquarters had been set up. And after that, regarding the venting activities, was there not contact made with you as you were traveling? As far as Fukushima's situation at that time was concerned, Mr. Komori was the central figure who had contacted me. And as far as that vent that you had just pointed out was concerned, first, I think it was 1 a.m. or so. As far as the venting activities and the implementation of that was concerned and taking action, that was something that I was contacted about. This is the venting activity, so radioactive substances are involved. And we needed to discuss with NISA this matter. And I heard from Mr. Komori he would be going to the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, NISA, to talk about that. As far as venting is concerned, as you had mentioned, whether it be dry venting or wet venting, the extent would be different. But in both cases, radioactive substances would be released. And this would be a case where there would be health effects. And if there is a wrong decision made, is it the president who takes the responsibility for those decisions, or is it Mr. Komori? As far as venting is concerned, whether or not this would be done and the judgment about that, basically, that would be done by the head of the power plant, because the head of the power plant itself knows the site most well. But these are radioactive substances, as you had rightly mentioned. So if there is an issue that would arise, then it is an executive issue, so therefore I would be the person who would naturally be responsible. From that point of view, as far as Mr. Komori is concerned, he did make his inquiries to you, the president, and you returned at 9 or 10 o'clock the next day, is that correct? Yes, I think it was probably around 9:30. If that is the case, then as far as the venting activity is concerned, there was still considerations being made within TEPCO, and you were not there. And at that time, the venting activity could not be done. It was impossible to do if the executives could not be contacted to confirm whether they could go ahead and do this. As I had mentioned, I would make my judgment as president, basically speaking, as far as whether this would be done or not. That judgment would be made by the acting head of the nuclear countermeasures headquarters. Technically speaking, I understand how the people on site would make their judgment, but the go sign would be given by the president, would it not, as you are in charge? If I am not reachable and venting needs to be done, then it would be the vice president, who is also a director. So he would take that responsibility. But this time, they were able to contact me, so I would be responsible. So therefore, they contacted you by telephone, I understand. And if they were not able to contact you, then Mr. Muto would be the acting individual. He was at the off-site center. So Mr. Komori would be the person who would have the ultimate responsibility as the executive. When I had spoken to Mr. Komori, he said that the venting activity is an important activity for the executive members. So therefore, the president needs to give the go sign. Is that a difference of opinion? Well, if contact cannot be made, and such a thing was the circumstance that they had found themselves in, then there would have been a judgment made by the managing director. And that is how the organization works. So therefore, as far as this venting activity is concerned, you did receive this contact. So when was it that you gave the go sign as president to conduct this venting activity? I think it was a little after 1 o'clock on the 12th. I had heard from Mr. Komori at that time. And the venting activity and the go-ahead regarding that, that's something that they had spoken to NISA about. And as far as the venting is concerned, I was able to confirm that that activity would be done. And so therefore, if there was an issue, then it would be the president's responsibility. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. As far as seawater injection is concerned, how was that sorted out? As far as seawater injection was concerned, this is different from fresh water. So therefore, as far as injecting seawater is concerned, there will be a huge effect that would be sustained by the facilities as a result of that injection. But as far as this case was concerned, we needed to cool down the reactor, and that was most essential, most critical. Therefore, even if seawater injection were to be hesitated, or if there is a judgment made not to decommission the plant, let's say hypothetically, by not being able to inject water, there would be major consequences. And I do understand, looking back on this situation, how seawater injection judgment needed to be made without hesitation. And the head of the nuclear power plant at that point also made a judgment at a very early stage that if they run out of fresh water, it would be seawater. Was there consultation with you, the president, as far as the seawater injection was concerned? I think it was after I reached headquarters that seawater injection was decided. It was on the 12th. Unit 1, I think it was about 12 o'clock, around noontime. I was already there at the countermeasures headquarters, and as I had just mentioned, as far as the judgment pertaining to seawater injection was concerned, that was made at that time. As far as this judgment was made, and when the seawater was actually injected, it was after 1900 hours, so quite a lot of time had elapsed. And at that time, as management, was there any other response that you had taken vis-a-vis this matter?
At the very forefront, who shall be in charge of injection of the seawater, they were in a very difficult situation, and what is important is for them to take an action. I was at the headquarters, being the head, and we were in the position to provide the support to the front line. In that sense, since the front line was faced with a difficult environment, whether it's the issue of the equipment and others, the countermeasures headquarters at the head office is to provide as much support as possible, for example, materials, equipment, and others, so that we are to provide the full-fledged support to the front line. Coming back to the seawater injection, what was the timing for your decision? When you came back to the head office, that would be the time when the fresh water would be already used up. And you knew that the fresh water would be used up because there's a certain limit as to how much fresh water is available. It's not limitless, so it's going to be out sooner or later. So rather than to wait until this fresh water is not going to be available, weren't you able to make a decision earlier before you were out of the fresh water? Well, to tell the truth, we knew that the fresh water would not be sufficient, so that the power plant had come to the decision as well as to make the preparations to inject the seawater. So there was that process before the fresh water ran out. And as I said, it was around 12 o'clock that the approval was given. When you were not at the head office till the time that you went back, were you contacted about the possibility of the injection of the seawater? Is it before I arrived at the head office? Yes. In regard to the injection of the seawater, well, I do apologize, but deviating somewhat. I came back to Tokyo via helicopter from Shinkiba, and from Shinkiba in the car, the person in charge of nuclear reported to me as to the status. And in it, needless to say, the water injection and the venting were the central topics that were reported to me to be the priority issues. But in it, I recall that I was not reported of the possibility of injecting seawater at that time. First, it was going to be the fresh water. At the early stage, you knew, and the Prime Minister's office also expected that the seawater would be injected, but they felt that the activity on part of TEPCO was somewhat slow. According to what we heard from the politicians at the Prime Minister's office, the delay in the injection of the seawater as well as the venting have resulted in distrust towards TEPCO. As the president, have you endeavored to do away with this distrust towards TEPCO? Whether it's the seawater and or the venting, I shall be repeating myself, but the people at the front line had lost power, and there was a high level of radioactive substances. In addition, the activities themselves had to be worked in shift. So the situation was quite tough at the front line, I must say. And in terms of the timeline, things have taken much time, which is the truth. But even so, we have exerted the maximum efforts. So, as I said, in it, should I say order or instruction? At that time, we were working on it, but maybe the word uneasiness is not right, but we felt some uneasiness. Before you came back to the head office, the Prime Minister had already visited the site. And what was your impression having heard about this? You mean the visit of the Prime Minister to the site? Yes. It was during the time I was not yet at the head office, and I have heard about it, and to the extent I've heard, as I have just said, the people at the plant were making the preparation to carry out the venting, and they were exerting the maximum efforts. And in that environment, the Prime Minister was to make a visit. Mr. Yoshida, the general manager, and Mr. Muto, who was the head of the headquarters, was there, and their time will be taken. So in terms of the people who were in charge of the power plant, I had the impression it's not something that's most desirable. What do you think was the cause of the visit? Didn't you think it was because of you? No, that's not my understanding. Well, the Prime Minister's office felt that since TEPCO is intentionally delaying the venting as they felt, or that TEPCO is slow in taking the countermeasures, and there were such suspicions on part of the Prime Minister's office. And what is important for you as the president is to eradicate such suspicions. If they had some suspicions, and why was it that they had the suspicion? That's something that I'm not aware of and I do not know. But whether it's the general manager of the power plant, as well as all the people at the power plant and the people at the headquarters, we gave the highest priority to take the necessary countermeasures. So whether it's the distrust, well, we were not in the situation to feel that, to be very honest. So you didn't feel that the activity of the Prime Minister's office was unnatural. Did you feel that why are they coming? Because despite the fact we are so busy, but you didn't consider why was it that the Prime Minister wanted to make the visit? You didn't feel any sense of crisis that the Prime Minister couldn't feel assured unless he saw it with his own eyes? Whether the Prime Minister's office had the sense of crisis or not, after I came back to the head office, and whilst I was taking the necessary activities, I didn't feel that. Did you confirm once you were back? And did you confirm with the Prime Minister's office? I was away, but I am back at the head office so that I shall be heading the activities. Did you inform them? I didn't make a call myself. There is a group that gets in contact with the government bodies, and usually a counterparty would be with NISA, in which we would communicate different activities. Whether we use that channel or not, I don't know, and if allowed, I would like to confirm that. So right now, as I sit here, I'm not sure whether it was reported using that channel. I wanted to talk about the issue of the withdrawal. The President has made many calls to the Prime Minister's office, haven't you? Are you talking about the 14th, the afternoon or the late afternoon of the 14th? Yes. This is something I want to come back to later on. But compared to that, immediately after the accident, you, Mr. Shimizu, as the president of TEPCO, had hardly got in touch with the Prime Minister's office. Why was that? It's not that there's any specific reason that I can cite, but once I was back at the head office, I was aware of the difficult situation. So at the headquarters, we were very busy to come up with the countermeasures, which was the highest priority. And that was the highest priority on my part as well. In regard to the nuclear energy response law, it says that the president of the power company was to get in contact with the Prime Minister's office, or was it a different system? In regard to the communication under the Nuclear Energy Response Act, I have not enough knowledge about how to position this act itself, but whilst we were doing the activities at the headquarters, I didn't feel the need as much. To the extent we understand, the Nuclear Energy Response Act says that NISA is to serve as a secretariat, so that the operator is to communicate with NISA. And as in the past, is it true to understand that TEPCO has communicated frequently, and we know that's a fact. So you felt that was sufficient? Basically, as you say, between the operator, our counterparty would be NISA, and that would be the basic channel of communication. I see, I understand. Since we did talk about the water injection, seawater injection, let me come back to that once again. This is a fact that has come a number of times, so I just like to confirm, or should I say, I'd like to hear your impressions at this point. Pertaining to the seawater injection, it was little after 19 o'clock that the site has launched this, and they have started the seawater as we have understood. However, the Prime Minister's office had a different thought, and probably Mr. Takeguro, gave the instruction of the temporary suspension of the injection. But at the site, there was no way that they could suspend the injection, so naturally they continued with the injection of the water. When you saw this situation, as the president of TEPCO, where did you think that the problem had lied?
Well, as far as the events were concerned, Mr. Takeguro was there at the Prime Minister's residence, and he heard from the Prime Minister about the possibility of re-criticality occurring. So therefore, there was this concern that was expressed by the Prime Minister, and how Mr. Takeguro had received this concern was a separate matter, but he was not able to dispel it. And the head of the nuclear countermeasures headquarters for the country is the Prime Minister. So without the Prime Minister's okay to continue forward with whatever action would not be something that could be considered, we had heard. And the technical people, of course, at the headquarters were making their considerations, but within a short period of time, to try to receive the acknowledgement and then to do it, this would be very important, because if it takes a lot of time, then it could not be done. So to try to receive that acknowledgement in a short period of time was very important. And as far as that is concerned, that's something that I had affirmed. I'd like you to please consider, as far as headquarters was concerned, when you think about the general manager of the plant or the site or the people who are working on the front line in the yard on site, and their technical knowledge and what they're trying to do, utilizing that technical knowledge, for the president to say, don't do this operation, but do this other operation. Are you in the position to give that kind of instructions? Well, the facilities itself, understanding the facilities and the operation of those facilities, you do need quite a lot of technical knowledge to do that. So the headquarters for nuclear countermeasures has their own consultations that they hold, and the operations are then conducted, and the general manager of the plant, of course, is very familiar with the plant itself. So his judgment is taken into account as well. So as far as each of the operations are concerned, of course, I don't have the expert knowledge, but I do have these experts who are working on these operations, and they can do their confirmations, and the information is being shared with myself as well, so I can make my confirmation. Yes, that's usually how it's done, to support the on-site activities and to consult with them and to share the scientific knowledge between yourselves and to make the final management judgment as necessary. I understand that. But why was it that this Prime Minister's office and residence, which was far away from the on-site people, why was it that TEPCO listened to the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister's residence and the people assembled there, rather than the people who were on site, rather than saying TEPCO valued their thoughts over the people working on site and their thoughts? Please understand that I had the awareness that the Prime Minister could not understand the situation very clearly, and I really tried my best to make certain we can get the Prime Minister's acknowledgement in a short period of time, even if seawater injection is done. The reactor and the danger within that reactor rising dramatically all of a sudden was not something that would happen, or it would not be so dangerous for the people all of a sudden. So having heard from various people, this was something that ought not have been decided by the head of the headquarters. The on-site people felt that way, but why was it that management did not come to this conclusion? I'm going to be reiterating what I've said before. The Prime Minister himself had his own awareness, and within a short period of time, that was what we were focusing on and made our judgment. But what if the Prime Minister's judgment is clearly incorrect? Then what would have been done? As you saw, the general manager of the power plant and the people on site, their judgment should have priority over anyone else's, and this would be the matter that would be discussed. Mr. Takeguro is an expert for nuclear power, and if there is that injection that takes place, recriticality may take place. That discussion is being discussed. This is a possibility. Did you all understand that this was a possibility? This was Mr. Takeguro, who was a fellow, his awareness, but we could not receive the understanding of the Prime Minister. So to continue in the same vein, that was something we were concerned with. What were you concerned with? Prime Minister is the head of that countermeasures headquarters on a national level, but for the people of our country, this is an emergency situation. So what is the top priority is to make certain that the countermeasures are implemented. And it's not an expert, and it is not an expert that is speaking, even if it is Prime Minister. That is one of the choices that you have, not to listen to what he has to say and go with what the experts have to say. Is that not true? Mr. Nomura, I do agree with what you have to say. I will be repeating what I've said before here. In a short period of time, we wanted to make a judgment and to resume. And if there was to be a discussion over and beyond that, then we would have done that. We don't have very much time, so I'd like to move on. So I'm not talking about a timeline necessarily, but as far as Unit 2 is concerned, the situation was becoming very dire. From Mr. Madarame to the general manager, technical guidance, technical orders were given. Do you recollect this as being the case? Yes, I do recollect that. What sort of guidance, instructions were given? As far as Unit 2 was concerned, from the 14th, a very severe situation was unfolding. We really needed to lower the pressure, and venting needed to be done, and injection of water needed to be done. As far as venting was concerned, and the SR valve and assuring the safety of that pressure vessel was something that needed to be considered. How could we react to this? Not a technical matter, but we've had a TV conference to discuss these matters. So the site people said, let's make this a priority. But this was not going very quickly. It would take a lot of time, they were saying on site. So therefore, that safety valve, this is something Mr. Madarame was an expert on, so he made a suggestion pertaining to that valve, the SR valve. And as far as the on-site situation was concerned, I understood the doctor as giving the instructions as an expert. Yes. So therefore, the on-site people were thinking about different procedures, but Mr. Madarame was saying there's a different way of doing this. And having looked at the situation, the president had said, please follow Mr. Madarame's guidance. You said this to the people on site there at Fukushima Daiichi. And then what happened as a result? As far as Unit 2 and the venting activity was concerned, that's something that we were really struggling with. And it really didn't go very well. And as far as the SR valve was concerned, this was something that was opened. But as far as Mr. Madarame, following his instructions, it turned out in a way that you had not desired. Is that not true? Technically speaking, that's something I can't really address. However, as far as the power plant was concerned, they did have their technical knowledge, and they were trying to work in parallel, and the SR valve was released. So I do believe they gave their expert knowledge. In actuality, they followed those instructions, and the consequences were not really desirous. And they said, see what happened. So therefore, the people on site were trying to implement their procedures, and the president, you were valuing what the prime minister and the members at the prime minister's office and residents were saying over the on-site people's opinions. I wasn't really trying to overemphasize one over the other. I was saying that it would take some time. And as far as this SR valve was concerned, it would take some time as well. And I said that I want to support them. And I did say that. As a result, rather than the employees on site, the expert who was there with the Prime Minister, you placed higher priority on this expert's opinion. I think it's a little bit different, the nuance. The SR valve and the venting, that's something that the site was working on. So I was trying to support them in what they were trying to do. That's my awareness of the matter. I understand. Well then, as far as the determination of what would be done, technically speaking, on site, I was able to further understand that. So I'd like to now ask some different questions. As far as this withdrawal issue is concerned, there's various matters that have been discussed. I'd just like to confirm the reality. Unit 2 was in a very dire situation. And as far as that countermeasure was concerned, there was a lot of give and take, and there was a lot of tension in that give and take that had taken place to deal with this matter. And as far as this is concerned, TEPCO, withdrawal of every last member, that is for them to leave the site, including the engineers, everyone withdrawing from that site, whether there was a decision made by TEPCO that such a thing would be done or not. I'd just like to ask further questions. We have prepared some documents here that we'd like you to refer to as we ask you these questions. Would this be all right? If you could please kindly refer to this slide. Here is a copy of it that you can refer to. We're talking about the 14th today, and even before then, Unit 2 was in a very dire situation. Just a moment, please. This isn't the correct document, is it? No, this is not the document. there's another page that ought to be here that is not here. And may I please ask for your assistance, staff members?
I'm sorry. There's a missing page. I do apologize to the people in the audience, but as we are going to prepare the missing page, and we'll show it to you as soon as it's ready, but due to the limited time, allow me to go ahead. We have looked at the teleconference that was carried out with TEPCO on the 14th at 16:57 in the afternoon. Mr. Shimizu said that please give me a report of the necessary countermeasures contemplating the worst-case scenario. What do you mean by that? As was said earlier, the number 2 unit had issue with the pressures, the issue with the injection, as well as there was the water level issue within the reactor. All of those were in a tough conditions. Thus, we need to consider the scenario as what might take place, technically that is, so that we shall be able to share the necessary countermeasures to be taken. That's what it meant. At that time, what was the very worst scenario that you had in mind at that time? Well, the water level would most likely go down and the fuel rod would be exposed. So that would be the worst case scenario. The very worst case scenario, that is. For example, there could be explosion of the vessel and others can also be contemplated. So considering this and all of that, is it true to understand that you have considered a number of scenarios? I don't know whether we even considered the possibility of explosion of the PCV, but we did consider lowering of the water level so that the fuels will be exposed. That's something that we understood could happen as the worst case scenario. I understand. At around this time, things got really tough. And as the president of TEPCO, we can understand that it's the appropriate timing for you to contemplate the worst case scenario. But less than an hour thereafter, you called Dr. Muto, who was traveling away from the offsite center. What was the purpose for this call? I apologize, but I don't recall what was discussed with Mr. Muto. I apologize. Is it was Mr. Muto was at the offsite center? No, he was going to come back because it's an emergency. At the Chuetsu Oki earthquake, the technical expert should be close to the offsite center. That's where Mr. Muto was headed. But since the offsite center was not functional, and on the other hand, the number 2 unit was in a difficult situation, so Mr. Muto was on the way to come back to the head office of TEPCO, and in the midst of his travel, you were able to get in touch, and Mr. Shimizu was trying to find a location to get in touch with Mr. Muto over the phone. So there must have been something that you wanted to discuss with Mr. Muto. I do apologize whether it was something to be consulted or whether just to confirm the situation. I'm not sure. But at that point, I don't think I confirmed the situation with Muto at that time. I apologize. My memory is not that clear. I'm sure some of the memories do fade away. But 1847, the Prime Minister talked with Mr. Yoshida, GM of the power plant. And to the extent we understand, General Manager Mr. Yoshino got in touch with Mr. Hosono. It was around 16 o'clock, saying that the number 2 unit is in a very dangerous position, or very close to the dangerous position. And at 1847, there was another call with the Prime Minister's office from the site. At that time, it was the Prime Minister himself who picked up the phone and confirmed. Mr. Yoshida said that he still can do things. When the former Prime Minister was here, he has voiced it himself. This means that the call should be made to the head office, but rather there was direct communication between the Prime Minister's office and the site. How do you feel about it, Mr. Shimizu, as the president of the company? In terms of communication with the Prime Minister's office, the emergency response headquarters at the head office would be the natural counterparty to get in contact. However, when things were really serious at the site, and when there was some confusion in the communication and information exchange, in terms of communication of the information, it might have been difficult to communicate fully. So maybe that was the reason. I am in part speculating. I see. And at 1928, Mr. Komori, who is the EVP, is headed to the offsite center to replace Mr. Muto. And Mr. Komori had said that please consider the standards for the evacuation. What does it mean by standards for evacuation then? The situation at the power plant, as repeatedly said, was in a very difficult situation, and the radioactivity nearby had gone up somewhat. So that, should I say rules or should I say procedures? Well, in any case, where the rules or procedures for evacuation was needed. So that was the intent. Well, in the worst case scenario, as you have said, or the very worst scenario, it means, for example, that there shall be the total withdrawal. Is that the standard? No, I don't think so. The full withdrawal is basically what was not in our mind at all. We were responding to the situation, whether it was the injection of the water or the venting. The power plant people were busy doing these activities, and they had to do other activities that would follow. That's the situation they were placed in. Thus, whether it's evacuation or withdrawal, that was not in our mind at all. In regard to the word evacuation, as you mentioned, I think it was under the understanding that not everybody had to be there. So that was the basis. As you have said, in considering the standards for evacuation, this was underway, and Mr. Muto had instructed Mr. Hara, who was his subordinate, to come up with procedures for evacuation, which was the instruction that was provided. This is some information that came apparent in the hearing that NAIC has carried out. If the reactor comes to this situation, only this many people will remain, and the remaining people would be bussed out to whatever the destination. Is that what was to be considered? Yes, exactly. At 1955, we saw the teleconference of TEPCO, and Mr. Takahashi, who is a fellow, in the same room with you. I think he was next to you, Mr. Shimizu, but Mr. Takahashi said, Mr. Muto, what time is going to be the full withdrawal? So he had the misunderstanding. Is that true? I think so. Because there was no need for everybody to be there. That's where it started. So that myself, as well as Mr. Muto, who was the head of the headquarters, as well as Mr. Katsumata, the chairman, and Mr. Yoshida, the general manager. This was the common understanding among the people I've mentioned. Mr. Takahashi was at the emergency response center, but should I say a misunderstanding? But at this point, as for the conversation that Mr. Takahashi voiced at that time, he said everybody. So I felt my understanding is different. So at that time, I sort of cautioned him. Yes, you looked surprised, and you looked at Mr. Takahashi. Yes, I remember that in the images. And it may be, as you say, Mr. Shimizu, but at 2016, everybody is going to evacuate to the visitors' hall. That was still being voiced. That was another misunderstanding? Yes, I think so.
If that is the case, then as was just mentioned, at this point in time, the situation was quite severe. So therefore, as far as the ultimate withdrawal, this consideration was being made, and you gave instructions to do that. But who will be staying and whom will be withdrawing? And that was not something that was decided at this point. Is that correct? That's correct. Therefore, this might be mentioned later on. The situation is a very severe situation currently. If it were to continue in this manner, then it would not be everyone, but there would be a small number of people who would remain there and do their activities. And there was this consideration that was also being made. That was the awareness. As far as the plant was concerned, they were saying they wanted to have the very minimum number of people remain, and they also wanted to have the women also withdraw, and then at the very least maybe about 10 people would be staying and the other would be withdrawn. And as far as the plant's awareness was concerned, did you also have the same awareness? Yes, I was aware of that. And as you had mentioned, within this process, how many people are there at the nuclear power plant? That was being confirmed, I do recall. There were administrative people and women employees as well who were included in that. About 700 of them were still there. If there are so many people who are there, then as I have said, for those people who are not involved in the emergency activities, we're talking about Fukushima Daini here, but based on that awareness, we decided to proceed forward. 20 minutes. Mr. Takahashi had recommended this, but the final withdrawal was not confirmed. And right now we're doing our confirmation activities, and we're trying to confirm the ground situation and make our decisions. That was what he had said. And as far as the final withdrawal was concerned, what sort of thing did you imagine at that time? As I had mentioned earlier as well. First, those people who needed to respond to the emergency, they would remain. And the people other than that would go to a separate place. And that's what we meant then. That is, even if it's temporary, we will have a certain number of people remain. And that was the determination that was to be made. According to this paper you have before you, this is a crisis situation. It might not seem that way on paper, and the people who are there, they are putting their lives on the line, and they are aware that they are doing so. And so they are trying to engage themselves in this activity, putting their lives on the line. And President, you at that time felt there was no choice but for them to remain. It was a very severe situation, of course. But It was not impossible to do work. I don't think it was like that at that time. And that was the situation as far as I was aware of it. So for those people who were doing their activities, at this point there were some proposals that were given, were they not? Well, Mr. Muto had given his guidance, and we decided to create a certain form at that point. And finally, 2000 hours 22, there was water injected into the PCV, and there was a sense of relief for a moment. However, the withdrawal criteria was still not decided at this point. Is that correct? 2100 hours 22 minutes. At that point, that's correct. The procedures have not been determined as yet. Unit 2. The Unit 2 situation, everyone was working very hard together in a collective manner. So therefore, the temporary withdrawal, that needed to be decided based on the conditions there on site. And as far as the final determination was concerned, it looked as if the situation has been contained at 21 hours, 22 minutes, but that was not the case. Unit 2 will become even more severe, and venting could not be done, and the situation is becoming very, very dire. And now they find themselves in this situation. And at 3:13, there was the determination of the withdrawal procedures for those non-emergency workers. Was that decided at this point or before then? As far as the procedural document is concerned, we confirmed the records that we had. And at this time, we created the paper document. Based on your awareness as president, as far as the withdrawal was concerned, the paper was finally decided at this point. But as far as the criteria for withdrawal was concerned, before it was made into a document, there were consultations being held and determinations being made. And the president, as far as the procedures, you understood this and you made a judgment that this is how things will unfold. As far as the paper itself is concerned, within this schedule here, I have not seen it because it's a procedure. So whether it be preparing the buses, and it says members who are not dealing with the emergency situation, what sort of procedures need to be followed. I have not seen that at this point. Then, President, well, how many people would be withdrawing? That's something that you didn't have the awareness until the very end. As far as the actual number of people who will be remaining and their roles, the general manager of the nuclear power plant needed to decide that. That was my awareness. So therefore, it was the next morning when this withdrawal took place, and the general manager of the plant decided who would be the core members and who will be withdrawing. So how many people will actually be remaining? That's something that was decided by the general manager. So therefore, President, you did not know until the very end how many people will remain, and the withdrawal already started taking place. It seemed as if ultimately about 70 people remain, but you decided you would leave it up to the on-site people, and you didn't receive any contact from them about this. Whether I received contact or not, including TV conferences, I don't have a clear recollection of that. However, for 70 people remaining, I did not receive a report of that myself, personally. Outside of the TV conference, I have a feeling that they contacted you. I think it was 2 a.m. or so that Vice President Muto and General Manager Yoshida were speaking on the phone. And perhaps that was handed to you, the phone call, when you were president. Is that not the case? General Manager Yoshida, there was a phone call, but as far as the content of that telephone call was concerned, I do apologize. I don't have a clear recollection of that. In fact, rather, Muto was talking with the head of the headquarters and the general manager, Mr. Yoshida, and I think he had an exchange of words with them. I don't really have a clear recollection of that. I understand.
I understand. It seems from the result, as we look at it, the so-called the full withdrawal was not decided, as the word is used in general. Then, on the 14th, at 1836, at quite an early timing, Mr. Shimizu, you were making phone calls to different people. With very many people, I would say, that you were consulting with quite a number of people. Or it may be that the phone was connected only with a few people, but we can see you trying to make phone calls quite repeatedly. At that time, you were consulting without understanding what would be the standard used in proceeding. As you said, it's not that I was trying to get in touch based upon a certain procedure nor a standard. What took place at that time is that there was some discussion of the temporary evacuation. And at the site, the self-defense force and others were working in this very difficult environment. And even if you say some people, it seems that it would be quite certain number of group of people that we're talking about, so that whether it's the minister in charge or NISA, I felt that it was something that I need to communicate. That was my judgment. The DG of NISA is somebody I understand, because based upon the Nuclear Emergency Response Act, the head of the NISA is to be informed because of the system in place. So you would call Mr. Terasaka, and it seems that you were not connected. And then call the assistant of the METI minister. And probably you must have talked with Minister Kaeda at that point. Why did you make this kind of phone call, and what did you talk with Mr. Kaeda? As was said earlier, you said frequently or repeatedly. Well, there were many phones that I tried but were not connected. Now, coming back to the phone call with the Minister of METI, I did say that the Fukushima Daiichi is in a very difficult situation. And if the situation is to continue, we can consider more difficulty to pile up, so that there would become a time when we need to consider the evacuation. That's what I told him. And people talk about the full withdrawal, but whether it's a full withdrawal evacuation, those are not the words I've used. But rather, our intent was that some people would remain, and well, the premise was that some people are going to remain. So that was a basis in which we talked about possible evacuation. And that was the basis in me calling Minister Kaeda. Minister Kaeda said in your seat, had said that he understood that TEPCO has decided for the full withdrawal. Why do you think that Minister Kaeda came to that conclusion? What do you think is the cause? Well, I would say what he had in mind is different from our intent. You asked me why. What was the cause? Well, that's something beyond what I can conceive of. Immediately after, you called Mr. Terasaka, and his impression is that I wasn't really sure what Mr. Shimizu wanted to communicate to me. So it seems that there had been some issue in how you communicated to Mr. Terasaka of NISA. As I said, we are going to leave some people, which was the grand premise. And I was trying to communicate that intent of the grand principle. On part of the receiver of the information, it's difficult for me to say what was in his mind, but it would have been something very sensitive or delicate. Well, in your mind, Mr. President, in the unlikely event, in the worst case scenario, from the perspective of saving lives, didn't you have the scenario in mind that everybody had to evacuate? No, not at this point. No, not at all. What about the word evacuation? What do you think is the meaning of the word evacuation? Well, the precise meaning could differ, but I consider that on temporary basis, people are to move away from where it is dangerous. That's how I understand the word evacuation. Yes. The word is often used in the world of nuclear power plants. As a safety-related issue, the word evacuation is used, in which for the people who are at the very front, in order, should there be any possibility of irradiation, they are going to evacuate themselves into a building which is going to be safe. In that sense, they would use the word, the full withdrawal. And I can understand the word evacuation might have been used in that sense, but whether it's everybody or whether it's some people, regardless of the number of people, but on a temporary basis, it only means to be away from the dangerous places. So if you use the word evacuation, there's a possibility of being misunderstood, that everybody is going to move away from where it's dangerous. At the point that I communicate, as you said, when I use the word evacuation, we do use the word in our manual. Not in the sense it was used this time, but it was going to be temporary withdrawal. No, temporary, excuse the interpreter, temporary evacuation of some. That's something I did communicate.